The Crystal Charter, Daughter of the Red Seal. Chapter 27. Sumine 3 passed into Safe Bay. Black spires and huge fire-eyed crows from the southwest coast had abated in favour of the jagged red rocks of the waste. Exposure to sea breeze caked the red rocks and the coastal towns with shades of black and darkest brown. In the waste around Safe Bay, the dry air lifted the rock dust into the wandering clouds, leaving the black land tinted with the fiery red that lay beneath the surface. Camulus appeared in the distance. A crooked slate spire rose from the only temple in the city, dedicated to worshipping Cain, the god of fire. Humans and hedge witches dwelt in the main, both picked off by warlocks dwelling north of Mother Lake, under the rule of the War Witch Guild. The fickle wizard Ull was still battling for control, since she had unexpectedly been granted her position only 5 years prior. Sumine 3 sliced the water gracefully, and docked by the air-scorched buildings stretched out by the water. Lit torches burned night and day down the streets, lighting the masked faces of all who walked by. Masks were worn to protect the mouth and nose from sudden winds of the Black Desert, but it was forbidden to go about with a veil over the eyes in any of Nemain's towns and cities. The black iris and fire skin signified honourable strength as a blessing from Cain, but eyeballs like coal were the easiest way to identify a warlock. Black smoke cast into the sky by torches was offered to Cain in exchange for the strength to fight. Camulus was the closest city to Sachem Gorge, watched over by a fearsome city guard and surrounded by a huge black wall that skirted the edges. It was also one of the safest places in the main. The distance between Camulus and support from witches of the ruling guild left them to form their own impressive defences. The toppled Tower Inn sat close to the gnarled temple. Its interior black rock walls were marked with the brushed red fingerprints of guests. The common room held an enormous fireplace, empty as a desert pit at night. It would remain unlit in the heat of the day, but roar during the sudden cold of nightfall. Ashwood trees, made into spindly planks, composed all of the furniture inside the inn. Exquisite witch-made axes lined the walls, some with spent crystals affixed into the handle sockets. A hedge witch, gifted with musical training, was playing on a rounded harp by the void of the fireplace, a skin drum on the floor next to him, keeping tempo with the pulse of his magic. Maebe had spent each year at Camulus, trapped inside the ashy prison of the toppled Tower Inn, with a witch attendant. Her father had spent almost a week hiking to the gorge to offer his blood. The 2 years since he lost the use of his legs, he was carried on a palanquin, lifted magically by the witches who accompanied him. They made no other trades in Camulus, and it was always the final stop. "We have a room reserved for tonight," she told the stout man behind the bar as she pulled her scarf from around her nose and mouth. She knew dust had collected around her eyes in the same way it had on her travel companions. 2 guards from the palace, who would accompany her to Sachem Gorge and back. She knew their names, Arg and Fran, but lacked any desire to know anything else about them. They were loyal to the miserable king, who had sent her here without any time to mourn. "Sumine group, top floors reserved for your pilgrimage as always. Your witches arrived this morning," he grunted out. The innkeeper was broad, with a black moustache topping his burned skin, his grey apron marked with black dusty fingerprints. She followed the direction of his sun-baked hand and spied 2 jointed hats, rumpled from wear. One of the witches had several metalwork fingers, tapping on his jug with astonishingly lifelike movement. It marked them as the artificers that would lead her inland. Tomorrow they would meet with the 3 war witch warriors, and their company of 8 would leave for the gorge. Black wood steps creaked in protest as Maebe traipsed up the stairs, leaving her guards to socialise with the artificers. Roast meat smells floated up from the kitchen behind the innkeeper and almost enticed her. She had lost most of her appetite since being at sea. Food was a chore that she couldn't be bothered to do. Upstairs, she hid in her room with the door bolted. She'd stayed in the same room before. A giant 4-post bed was carved to imitate the skyline out of the paned window. Spires erupted from the top of the posts to float above her head as she slept. Heavy black velvet curtains hung from the engraved wood, allowing her to shut out the rest of the room and shelter from the night's chill. A black fireplace was scrubbed clean. It seemed at odds with the dagger marks engraved on the surface of the mantle around it. Her own dagger appeared in her hand, and she stabbed it firmly into the soft wood, then stood back to watch the top-heavy blade vibrate back and forth with the force she had used. 1 floor below, steamy rooms filled with warm bathtubs tempted her to go and wash the city's dirt and sweat from her face. The effort of leaving the room and encountering other guests seemed like too much hassle. Maebe poured the provided jug of refreshing water down a drain pipe. She tipped some water in a bowl from her skin, and then left the rest to drink later. A precaution her father had taught her. Generations ago, several Sumine merchants were poisoned with water ingested in Camulus, planted by some rebels who had supposedly disapproved of the few artificers living in the main. They thought killing the Sumines would chase them away. The artificers and Green Kingdom guards gave the murderers the justice that the War Witch Guild granted them, if they could catch them. They could kill them or give them to the less venerable fighting pits. There wasn't enough of them left for the pits. The youngest nephew, the only person suitable for the blood offering, had been rushed south on a second ship to make the deadline for the king's burden. Maebe sighed to herself at the thought of her long-dead grandfather, several years younger than herself, rushing to do his duty in the face of his family being killed. My family was killed too, she whispered to herself. How did you do it? She left a loaded backpack by the door with everything she would need for the next few days. Nestled in the bottom was a cloak as dark as the night sky. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it her first trip to Sachem Gorge. Her first blood offering. Sleep would evade her, as it had done every night since her father's death, but she curled up on the top of the bed anyway, slowly twirling a crystal that was as dark as the room around her.